Welcome to the next installment of our Korea and Coronavirus series, K Global Vaccine Hub, with the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, also known as IVI, Dr. Jerome Kim, and Deputy Director General, Dr. Manki Song. I'm Tom Byrne, President and CEO of the Korea Society. This interview was recorded at the International Vaccine Institute on the beautiful campus of Seoul National University here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you may be watching. Jerome is an international expert on the development and evaluation of vaccines and is the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Prior to IVI, he was a Principal Deputy, U.S. Military HIV Research Program, and Chief of the Laboratory of Molecular Virology and Pathogenesis at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and the U.S. Army Program Manager for HIV vaccines. Dr. Kim is an adjunct professor of medicine in Bethesda, Maryland, at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland, and is also an adjunct professor at Yonsei University, and was recently made a distinguished visiting professor at Seoul National University. He has authored over 300 publications. He was a graduate of the University of Hawaii with high honors in history and highest honors in biology, and received his MD from the Yale University School of Medicine. Dr. Kim has received numerous awards, most recently the Asia Pacific Vaccine Excellent Lifetime Achievement Award in 2021, and the Medal of Honor for Civil Merit from the Republic of Korea in 2022. Dr. Manki Song joined the International Vaccine Institute as a research scientist on July 1st, 2004, so you're at your happy work anniversary soon. He earned a BS degree from Seoul National University in 1992, and MS and PhD degrees in viral immunology from Pohang University of Science and Technology, also known as POSTECH. In 2001, he was appointed as an IVI postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Vaccine Development at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in Baltimore, USA. There he focused on the development of new generation measles vaccine using naked DNA and attenuated Shigella and Salmonella vaccines. More recently, as Deputy Director General of Science at IVI, Dr. Song expanded the scope of research to engage in the development of vaccines against the rotavirus, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, among other viruses. He has worked in collaboration with the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control, having received funding from the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, also known as CEPI. He was awarded the Prime Minister's Medal for his contributions to the COVID-19 response in 2021. Well, now we'll start with the questions. A very distinguished group we have here. So starting off, I thought I would give the big picture with what is the IVI, and then get into global vaccine hubs, and then getting to the heart of the issue, the K Global Vaccine Hub. So first of all, Dr. Kim or Dr. Song, what is the IVI? It's established in Seoul. Why? What was the public health need then? Who are the member countries? And how is it funded, or whatever else you'd like to add about the IVI?
So the International Vaccine Institute was founded in 1997 as an initiative of the United Nations Development Program. A number of countries put in a bid to host the headquarters of the IVI, and Korea won by offering the land that this building is on, the building itself, and to contribute roughly 30% of the operational costs of the Institute. It was the first international organization to be headquartered in Korea. And right now we have 39 member countries in WHO as participating partners in our international organization. We have partners from all over the world, from Asia, from Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and Europe. Regrettably not the United States yet, but I hope we'll be working on that. IVI's mission is to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health, with an overarching vision to see developing countries free from suffering from infectious diseases, and those have not changed over the past 25 years.
Right. And how is it funded?
IVI is rather unique. So, for instance, like the WHO, we receive some funding from state members. So at this point, it's the government of Korea, the government of Sweden, the government of Finland, and the government of India. That contributes roughly 20% of our total research or operational budget every year. The remainder come from grants. So we have to compete for grants like professors at universities do. And we write grants to the Gates Foundation, to the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, to the Wellcome Trust, to Open Philanthropy. And depending on the vaccine, we may need to get multiple sources of funding. Because vaccine development is not a simple research grant, but a real exercise in moving a product forward from the identification of the initial vaccine in the laboratory, which is what Manki's lab does, through clinical trials, through testing and approval, and then to use and uptake and implementation. So we're a bit like a research institute that develops things at the bench. We're a little bit like a biotech company that takes these products forward. And in the end, we're an international organization that wants vaccines to have impact. And the only way we do that is to get people vaccinated.
Right, right. So you actually do the development and manufacturing of vaccines here?
The one thing that we don't do is manufacturing. And actually that's written into our constitution. So unlike many organizations, IVI develops the technology. Manki's lab will develop the technology, for instance, for oral cholera vaccine or for a new vaccine against enteric fever or typhoid. And we will then do a technology transfer. We will, without without any licensing fee, transfer the ability to manufacture the vaccine to manufacturers around the world. And typically we use developing country vaccine manufacturers. So of the 8 recipients of different technology transfers, Brazil, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Korea, all have received different technology transfers, again, without license fees for global health purposes.
And where do you conduct your clinical studies?
Again, because we are primarily interested in vaccines for global health, we conduct the vaccine trials typically outside of Korea, although that's changed recently, but in low and middle income countries, so the Philippines, Thailand, Nepal, countries in Africa. We're doing a large phase 3 trial in 5 countries in Latin America.
Okay, good. And who regulates what you're doing? I mean, there must be some regulatory body that looks at what you're doing.
Yes, so we actually have to deal with multiple regulatory bodies. For vaccines that are manufactured in Korea, it's the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety here in Korea. For vaccines manufactured, for instance, the chikungunya vaccine is manufactured in India. So we fall under the DCGI, the Drugs Controller General of India, which is their regulatory agencies. If we're working with a Chinese company, then it will be the NMPA. Most recently in this collaboration with SK Bioscience on their COVID-19 vaccine, we were engaged in multiple regions around the world, and since SK is the sponsor, the holder of the rights for the vaccine, and this was their vaccine that they developed, IVI was just helping them to execute the trial, but ultimately, hopefully, this will go forward to what we call one of the stringent regulatory authorities, like the European Medicines Agency, right. Or to MHRA, or maybe ultimately to the FDA.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you don't just have scientists here; you have administrators or lawyers and the whole range of personnel that you need to have effective vaccines in the world, right?
Yes. So I mean, and we really do everything except for manufacturing. Mm-hmm. We don't have a lawyer on staff, although we often have wondered whether we often wonder whether we should, but we use law firms in Korea
right.
and elsewhere.
Right. Okay. Good. Okay. So all right, now we're getting closer. But what is a global vaccine hub? I mean, why is this word global in there? I mean, particularly in relation to the current situation where there's a need to manufacture more COVID-19 vaccines. Because there's vaccine production centers in the U.S., UK, Europe, even India you mentioned. Why is there a need for something called a global vaccine hub?
So I'm going to turn it over to Manki, but I'll just frame the answer a bit. So I think a big difference in the way, and I'm speaking as an American, the way they do things in Korea is a lot more systematic. Back in 2010 there was an issue. with vaccine nationalism, preventing US-made vaccines for flu from coming to Korea, potentially. Recognizing that this was a threat to the health and security of the Korean people, the Korean government started a process which has culminated in the creation of this vaccine hub, which Manki will describe. But it's a systematic effort to develop a vaccine industry that was number 11 in the world and to make it number 5 in the world. And that's the kind of thing that the government thinks about, funds, and then executes. So, Manki.
Right. Yeah. As Jerome mentioned, I think it was a start as like year 2010 after the pandemic influenza outbreak. At the time, Korea cannot secure any vaccine from outside. So I think that time, it was start that time, and many vaccine experts at the time get together how we can secure the vaccine when we want. So I think from during the discussion we made ambitious plan. We need to make our own vaccine. So self-sufficiency issues, it's like a self-defense, like like military thing. So many government also, they decide to support that plan. It was quite ambitious because at the time Korea we produce the vaccine we need only less than 20%. But that plan was like that we will produce at least 80% the vaccine we need until year 2020. So only like in 10 years, maybe you need to vaccine development produce like more than 15 like. So it's really, really ambitious. So I explained in IVI, I changed the time. I changed to year 2025 because I'm vaccine expert, so I think year 2020 it's too much ambitious. So I think I was right because right now I think it's only 50% of self-sufficiency, production of vaccines. But anyway, it's a huge achievement. So I think it was a start. And we build many institute, many research institute or many CMO producing centers, something like that. So Moti, Minister of Trade, they made, Korea Bio CMO Center, bacteria-based and cell culture-based vaccine production system. This is not production, but this is for production of GMP material, which is needed for clinical trial. That way, Korea government support a lot for private sectors. And also KNIH, they made a Center for Vaccine Research. I participate in the modeling of that institute. We modeled the USA Vaccine Research Center. So similar institute was built like 2 years ago, and they started research functions under KNIH. So, but also to expand during this COVID, we found that need is huge, and also Korea government wanted to more functions, not just self-sufficiency. They wanted to produce vaccine for global, especially for developing countries and other world. So I think that plan was like just 10 years, but already we produce a lot, and also Korea government support more than $2 billion, something like that, for vaccine production and for this K-vaccine hub support.
There were other pieces as well. The Vaccine 3.0, which did the bioproduction centers and the Center for Vaccine Research. Then there was an effort to create a fund that would take things out of the laboratory into the clinic. We call that the first valley of death. That's where innovation kind of dies. Great innovation in the universities, we can't get it into the clinic. But this new fund, which is Korean government, Gates Foundation, and Korean companies, actually picks projects that look promising to take them out of the laboratories. So that's called the Right Fund. And then there's another big effort, actually now there are 3 of them, hundreds of millions of dollars over 7 to 10 years to develop the research platforms for vaccines. So innovative new platforms like RNA or the viral vectored vaccines. Bringing them into Korea, developing expertise in using them and developing vaccines with them, training PhDs and technicians to work in a biomanufacturing field, and then ultimately the K-Vaccine Hub. So you can see how all of these things relate together in a way that will create a sustainable, strong industry here in Korea. And that's why, so as an outsider looking in, it seems the most remarkable thing because we don't see this. But when you think about how Korea went forward with steel and cars and batteries and TVs and smartphones,
Semiconductors,
you see the way that government can interact to build sustainable value for the country.
Yeah, as Song was talking about this, I'm thinking about POSCO's development, Hyundai and Samsung and SK and all these other companies that were very focused, had a strategic plan and had remarkably rapid achievements in all these industries. So you're part of this whole Korean scene in developing industries. This one happens to be in vaccine. So if I can just, from what you said, so when you started out, the K Global Vaccine Hub, in essence, started years ago, right? Yeah, right. And although now we're just hearing about it, but it was out there. It was being formed. Maybe it's formalized now. So at that time in 2010, you were producing 20% of the vaccines. Only 20% of the vaccines used in Korea were produced domestically. Now you're up to about 50%, and your target is 80% in 2025.
Okay. Actually, 2023.
Oh, 2023. So that's next year. Okay, 2023. It's important.
It's a targeting, but I'm pretty sure it takes more time.
It takes more time. Okay. Well, aim high, right? Do you? How much of that will be exported? I mean, this. Now you have this global inserted into the vaccine hub in the name. So this suggests that you'll be producing vaccines to be used outside of Korea. Do you have an export target as the other industries did?
From the beginning, Korea government and target like vaccine number 5, global market share like number 5, something like that. So right. I think I'm not sure how much it is, but the Korea government plans like that. That's right. A first target, I guess, because I think Korea right now, I think we are not producing for globally. I mean, just a few vaccine we are now exporting, but Korea government wanted to produce in Korea, but ultimately they wanted to export the vaccine also. Yeah.
And when you think about the size, often we say that you need a country of 100 million people in order to have a sustainable indigenous vaccine industry. Right. Korea's population is 50 million. But it also has a significantly export-driven economy. Right. So the ability of Korean manufacturers to make a high-quality, low-cost product makes their vaccines competitive when we think about where vaccines are used in the world. And I think Korean products will be recognized as being high quality.
Right. So the only thing I can think of an equivalent is in the U.S. at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was something called Operation Warp Speed, right? Mm-hmm. And I've read, I think, one of the first directors of Operation Warp Speed, or else the guy who initially directed it, said that one of the greatest breakthroughs was the collaboration between politicians and the pharmaceutical industry, which was lacking in the U.S., and they got together to do this. And in record time, they developed, they accelerated the development of vaccines that were effective, safe, and of high quality. And of course, that cost about $18 billion, I understand. Is this at all, I mean, how does IVI and your global vaccine hub look at Operation Warp Speed? Are any lessons that you would apply to your efforts, or was this operating an achievement in a completely different system?
So, again, the system that the U.S. used actually may be remarkable to the vaccine industry. But when we think about the way the U.S. procures airplanes for the Air Force or tanks for the Army, it's a very similar model of cooperative development of a product that the government needs, and in this case, they needed vaccines. Right. So really the acquisition model that, that they used for Operation Warp Speed is similar to the one as the program manager for HIV vaccines that I was used to thinking about vaccines, ultimately an HIV vaccine, that would be used by the U.S. military. I think Korea has a very different approach.
Yeah, Korea has, from the beginning, has a complete different approach. Korea more focused on importing the vaccines from like Pfizer, or we imported vaccine personally like AstraZeneca, then Pfizer and Moderna. So I think that was our first target. So I worked as like a government officer. Every week I attended a meeting together with all the government officers. Just me was not government officer. So we had a meeting every week, and we just the discussion is to import the vaccine as early as possible. So I think that after that the second priority was the developing our vaccine. I mean, the Korea vaccine development by ourselves. So that was, I think, the SK Bioscience recently they announced the success of their vaccine development. So they not finally approved, but mostly they approved from MFDS their COVID vaccine. But that was not our own. We collaborated with the Gates Foundation and CEPI. So I think, well, anyway, so that vaccine will be produced in Korea. So I think that was different, very different approach. But that also was government support a lot. So also after that vaccine import, success of vaccine import, Korea government changed the committee name, vaccine development. So I also work in that committee. So we focused on the vaccine development from the beginning, but our focus was import, then our focus was developed by ourselves.
Right, right. And of course, vaccines have risen to the foreground with the COVID epidemic. What's your relationship with WHO and this alphabet soup of organizations, Gavi, CEPI, COVAX, in responding to the pandemic?
So it depends on the organization, but IVI is an executor. We develop vaccines, we help companies to make them, we get them approved, and we help countries to use them and generate evidence that they're actually doing what they're supposed to do. So in a way, we're the arms and legs of many of the organizations that you listed there. The WHO helps to make policy. In fact, the WHO has a seat on our board. CEPI is a global funder of vaccines for emerging infectious diseases. They're now the largest funder of IVI. Through competitive grants that IVI has applied for and secured, and working with companies like SK, which is funded by CEPI, IVI is really contributing, we think, to this global mechanism for distributing vaccines around the world to low and middle income countries called COVAX, which is one of the other things that you listed. And when you look at all the companies that we've collaborated with that have vaccines in late stage testing, Sanofi, SK, hopefully soon a Korean company called Solid, the companies have committed over 1 billion doses to COVAX. So in a sense, IVI's contribution to this is to provide vaccines for this mechanism that will distribute vaccines all over the world. And I think that's really remarkable given that we're only 200 people in size.
It is remarkable. So COVAX is focused solely on coronavirus vaccines, is that right? And then CEPI or Gavi would be looking at other vaccines, right?
Yes, so CEPI, so COVID-19 is only one of the vaccines that CEPI is looking at. They're looking at a vaccine for chikungunya. So this is a mosquito-borne disease that is common actually throughout the warmer parts of the world, including the southern parts of the United States. And an Indian company called Bharat is funded by CEPI to develop its chikungunya vaccine, and IVI is executing that phase 3 trial in 5 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, we're working on the Middle East respiratory syndrome, or MERS, another coronavirus, again, a priority disease for CEPI, and then ultimately Lassa fever, which is a disease that is found primarily in West Africa. A new grant was announced with SK Bioscience looking at an RNA vaccine for Lassa, and IVI is lucky to be partnered with them on that product. So we work with a lot of the diseases that CEPI is interested in, often with CEPI funding or sometimes with Korean government funding, in order to respond to the need for vaccines for global health.
Right, and it's global. Chikungunya, am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that was a disease I became familiar with, and not intimately, and when I lived in Singapore, when I worked in Singapore, because it's prevalent in Singapore, and actually one of my staff got it right before he joined. It's pretty serious.
And it's an interesting disease because many of the diseases we deal with, have mortality in the hundreds of thousands. Chikungunya doesn't kill as many people, but it makes them very sick and non-productive for sometimes months. And so for middle-income countries and low-income countries, that takes people out of the workforce. It means people can't earn their living. So it has a tremendous effect, but not in the way that we're used to thinking about, for instance, COVID vaccines.
Well, my colleague recovered and is one the most productive workers at that office. So I'm glad about that. So moving to this this concern about global vaccine equity, and there was, I think, some criticism and concern with Operation Warp Speed in the U.S., where it was just directed to, initially was designed to produce vaccines just for the U.S. population. Where are we now with getting enough vaccine, particularly the COVID vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, out to the global population?
And it's funny, I mean, we talk about the vaccine gap, but really there were maybe 4 big gaps in COVID. The first was a diagnostics gap, because we didn't know where the disease was, and we didn't know where the variants were. So there's a sequencing gap as a part of the diagnostics gap. Then there was the vaccine gap. So once we had the vaccines, once we showed that they were safe and efficacious, we didn't distribute them, or we couldn't distribute them equitably around the world. COVAX was supposed to fix that, and COVAX was partial success. It delivered only half the number of doses it wanted to deliver, and because it was so slow, countries went around COVAX and tried to purchase vaccine wherever they could for whatever price they could get it at. And that was not the intent of the mechanism. And then, so ultimately COVAX needs to be fixed, but if it is fixed, it becomes an amazing mechanism to ensure that innovative technology gets out to low and middle income countries, maybe not even just for pandemic diseases, but for those diseases where 60% of the world's children have not been vaccinated against rotavirus. A substantial number of young women have not been vaccinated against cervical cancer viruses. So, if COVAX works, it becomes a way to get new technology out very quickly. So that would be great. But the third gap is a vaccination gap. And that meant that now we have a fairly large amount of vaccine, but we don't have any uptake. And so if you look at low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, over 80% of the people have not received a single dose of vaccine, yet we have a lot of vaccine. People are destroying vaccine. A small company that was set up to help make vaccine available in South Africa is talking about shutting down its production because no one wants the vaccine, even though not enough people are vaccinated. So there's a vaccination problem, and really that's a longer-term problem where we need to invest in health systems.
So is that vaccine hesitancy?
In part, it's vaccine hesitancy, but it's also because the governments themselves don't necessarily see the need. When you think about the cost of vaccination, in some low-income countries, the cost of vaccinating the entire population for COVID is 60% of the health budget. Nice. And so, as countries are thinking about this, they need to say, well, what is the cost-benefit of vaccination? And we don't have those data yet for low and middle-income countries. It's really obvious for the high-income countries, but it's less obvious to leaders in low-income countries, in part because we didn't do any diagnoses, and people don't know how much disease that was actually present in some of the low-income countries. I think the final part, and this is where the U.S. Could play an important role, or with the G7, is a leadership gap. Who is responsible for dealing with a global crisis? Was it the United Nations? Was it WHO? And who's given the funding to be able to respond? And who's made accountable by the governments to ensure that there was equitable distribution of vaccine, or that there was the vaccination programs actually worked? We don't have a person. So into this leadership gap, we have billions and billions of dollars flowing now from the momentum of COVID, and we need to make sure that we develop sustainable solutions.
Right. Yeah, it seemed to me what the world really needed was a global Operation Warp Speed, right?
Yes.
Right. That would have been very powerful. Okay, turning to something that I have noticed. So the World Trade Organization, which is not the World Health Organization, has this program where there's a partial patent waiver for COVID-19 production in developing countries. And so I have a couple of questions about that. First of all, given the surplus of vaccine in the advanced countries, and what you just said, some vaccines going unused, some supply vaccine going unused in developing countries, why is this necessary, or what's the model for making this work? And does this serve as a disincentive to developing the next generation of vaccines and in innovation? Because it seems like pandemics are occurring more rapidly than global financial crises, which are about every 10 years or so. And vaccines, I mean pandemics. We've had 2003, we had the SARS one. In 2009, 6 years later, we had the H1N1. And then in 2015, Middle East respiratory syndrome, that became very important and very prominent in Korea. And now in 2019, SARS-2 or COVID-19. So what role will this have in getting more vaccination in lower and middle income countries, the WTO partial patent waiver?
So I'm not sure right now that impact is not that important. I mean huge, because already, as Jerome mentioned, many vaccination we already did, and they are resisting the vaccination. So, but I think that can be important in next pandemics.
Next pandemic.
Because many people wanted to develop vaccine using messenger RNA or the same technology which was used in this corona.
Right.
So when they apply this technology, I think the patent can inhibit that development. But I think this is maybe important for next pandemic.
And when you think about the patent is one thing, but for a vaccine, it's really the know-how to make the vaccine. And so the patent is maybe a bunch of 20 pages worth of paper that goes to the patent office that describes the invention and how you do it. The rest of it, which is a stack of booklets on standard operating procedures of how you do the vaccine, is actually the part that companies need to get. And if they don't get that, then they have to develop it all themselves, and that adds time. So if we really want to be efficient, the fastest way is to make a deal with a company that is willing to license or give the product with this giant stack of reports, recipes essentially, on how to make a vaccine. It's said that the BioNTech vaccine has 50,000 steps, and if you had to recreate that from scratch, even if you had the patent, it would still take you too long. So the patent waiver will be important, I think, as Manki says, for the next pandemic, or maybe, there's a lot of argument now about what should the next booster look like. Right. When we come up with the Omicron BA.5 variant that's put into a booster, how quickly will that technology be disseminated, and who's going to use it, and who will have access to it, or will we have the same problems that we did with the original set of vaccines? And I think that's a critical question.
Well, is the G7 addressing this new G7 initiative, or any other initiative to have that platform in place when perhaps another variant comes along, or the ones that we're dealing with now? So
I think that there are a number of initiatives, not only the G7 initiative, but for instance, BioNTech in Senegal, but also in Rwanda. So transferring the capacity to manufacture the vaccines doesn't necessarily transfer the technology that exists for any single vaccine. So that would either have to be created or transferred in an agreement with the new company. And I don't know the nature of those agreements. I mean, the agreements themselves take time. Sure. But the second part of this is, so say you have a vaccine. Say we transfer the ability to manufacture a vaccine to a country in sub-Saharan Africa. Does the country have an FDA equivalent that is competent to examine the mechanism of production or the data generated in clinical trials and do a good job of evaluating the product and approving it for use? So at the same time that we're talking about building manufacturing capacity in this G7 initiative, there's a lot of strengthening of regulatory authority capacity, because you really want vaccines. I mean, vaccines are given to healthy people to keep them healthy, and you want to make sure that the companies that are making the vaccines make the product that is safe and immunogenic and efficacious in humans. And so there are a lot of problems, which is again why leadership is going to be necessary to say, these are the things that are needed, this is the timeline, and here is the funding. And we're holding you accountable at the end of 5 years for making sure that all of these things are in place. Like the government of Korea. We want you to be number 5 by 2025 or 2023, and someone will be accountable to make sure that that happens. That's the way governments work. That's the way we should deal with pandemics.
So the equivalent of the government of Korea is missing in the international stage too.
At this point.
At this point, right. Where do you think this will come from? The UN, a UN body, or
yes.
UN organization, or G7, or?
So, the question is whether you incorporate it into some place like WHO, and I think there was an editorial by Bill Gates or a statement by him that said that the nucleus of this could be put in WHO. Would it be in the United Nations? Would it require like a health security council? Would you put it as a freestanding international organization with funding from states that are basically instructing the stakeholders, are telling them, this is your job, here's the funding, let's make the following things happen on the following timeline. I don't think we've come to a good solution yet. There's still a lot of discussion.
Right. Is there any hope that, for this, since diseases are global, cooperation with China. China's a member of the cooperation between the U.S. and Europe and China, which is lacking these days in other areas or problematic. In the realm of health, is there any prospect or hope that these countries can get together and cooperate and combine their resources? China's a member of the IVI. You have 5 European countries, members of the IVI. How do you see for global cooperation
So it's interesting because China is such a large country. A company that there's a state-run company called CNBG, China National Biotech Group. They make 70% of the vaccines used in China, which is a huge amount. It makes them one of the largest vaccine manufacturers, if not the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. So they have a large internal market. They're not really export focused yet. Sinopharm and Sinovac were widely used. I think 4 billion or 5 billion doses were distributed around the world. But it's a bit unusual. You see a lot more international vaccine manufacturing in India. Could there be better cooperation? Yes. Could there be an opportunity for countries to speed up the process that allows vaccines to be used in global health, particularly vaccines from countries that have what we call maturity level 3 or functional regulatory authorities, like China or Korea? Could those vaccines get out more quickly because there's alignment among the regulators of the world that says, if Korea approves it, then WHO will approve it for emergency use. And we don't necessarily have those agreements yet. I don't know, Manki, if you...
Yeah, it's quite, right now I think China is, they just do by themselves mostly. So, but through this COVID, I think they are more open for globally, and there are also many collaborations like CEPI also funded project with China, something like this. So, but I think, as Jerome mentioned, that China, they want to work by themselves. But I think, but this COVID, I think they understand the collaboration international is very important. So I think there will be a lot of changes in China. Yeah, we expect.
So for instance, we've been working with CNBG since May of 2020 to try and get funding for one of their vaccines to do testing around the world. We weren't successful, but that relationship now is a part of why we're working with Sinopharm to do testing to generate real-world evidence using their vaccine in Africa.
The COVID vaccine.
Their COVID vaccine.
Okay. Well, we're all very focused and concerned with the COVID pandemic. Just to conclude, I mean, what vaccine are you focusing on? What disease are you focusing on that you think should require more attention? Malaria.
So we work on what we call unincentivized vaccines for which the large companies haven't really shown an interest.
Right.
Typically, these are vaccines for low and middle income countries because, if you're a Pfizer or a Merck or GSK, you're not necessarily going to go after non-typhoidal salmonella, which may kill 100 to 200,000 people a year, but not in the United States, not in Europe or Canada. But IVI really believes that health can be improved. Health outcomes, economies will develop, children will do better in school, poverty will be reduced if we work on these vaccines. Now there are some vaccines that have both high-income country and low-income country possibilities. And the one that I like to talk about is called Group A strep. And most people don't know what Streptococcus pyogenes is, but almost everyone has had strep throat. So strep throat is caused by Streptococcus pyogenes. And in the United States, you have a sore throat, you go to the doctor, hopefully the doctor does a swab and tells you you have or don't have strep throat, and then you get a simple prescription for penicillin. And it turns out that we have a lot of sore throats, and most of them are not Group A strep. and that really the need for antibiotics doesn't really speed up healing of group A strep. What it does is it prevents group A strep from damaging the heart. And what happens if you're not treated is you develop progressive heart disease and heart failure. And this, we call it rheumatic heart disease, kills 300,000 people around the world every year. At the same time, there's not a single major company working on a group A strep vaccine. An additional 150,000 people die because the flesh-eating bacterium that we read about, sometimes very spectacular cases, is also group A strep. And, but you can imagine a parent in the United States saying, oh my goodness, I have to stay home from work because the school won't let my child into school because they had strep throat. And the economic costs are substantial in high-income countries from streptococcal throat infections. And in low-income countries from this horrible disease that causes young pregnant women to die of heart failure, which really shouldn't happen. And you know, we really believe that we need a concerted effort on this disease, but on other diseases, and we have CEPI for outbreak diseases, and thank goodness we had them for COVID. But there is no CEPI equivalent for these diseases that together, including HIV, TB, and malaria, that need vaccines, that kill 4 to 5 million people a year. And really there needs to be, let's take the momentum we have around COVID, the pandemic, and the importance of vaccines and translate that into momentum in all the other diseases for which vaccines might be very helpful.
It certainly would be very helpful for saving lives everywhere, right, as the science says.
Yes.
So you have your work cut out for you, and I wish you the best success. And thank you, Dr. Kim and Dr. Song, for your knowledge and insights on the realm of vaccines and on the Korean government's initiative in positioning Korea as a global vaccine hub. The new administration of South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol aspires to make Korea a globally pivotal state. From what I heard today, it seems very clear that the IVI is already playing a role in becoming a globally pivotal vaccine institute. Thank you.